The winding road leading to Hollow Glen was flanked by ancient, towering trees that cast long, twisted shadows. The canopy above intertwined so densely that it created an almost perpetual twilight, even in the middle of the day. Sarah and Mark had driven for hours, leaving the sprawling metropolis behind in search of tranquility and a fresh start. The sight of the quaint village nestled in the valley below filled them with a sense of anticipation and hope. "This is it," Mark said, his voice tinged with excitement as he steered the car down the final stretch. "Our new beginning." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the cluster of stone cottages and cobblestone streets that looked like something out of a fairy tale. "It's beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. The village was picturesque, with ivy-clad houses and blooming flower gardens, a stark contrast to the concrete jungle they had left behind. They pulled up to their new home, a charming cottage with a thatched roof and a small, neatly kept garden. The previous owners had left it fully furnished, a gesture they had found both generous and convenient. As they stepped out of the car, the air felt crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. "Welcome home," Mark said, wrapping an arm around Sarah's shoulders. Together they unloaded their belongings, the last remnants of their old life packed into cardboard boxes and suitcases. As they carried the items inside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, but the village seemed deserted, the only movement coming from the swaying trees and the fluttering of a few birds. Inside, the cottage was even more charming than they had imagined. Wooden beams ran across the ceilings, and a stone fireplace dominated the cozy living room. Sarah ran her fingers along the mantel, feeling the smooth, cool stone beneath her touch. "It's perfect," she said, smiling at Mark. They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and arranging their new home. By evening, they were exhausted but content. Mark suggested they take a walk to explore the village and perhaps meet some of their new neighbors. As they strolled through the narrow streets, they marveled at the well-preserved architecture and the serenity of the place. However, they couldn't help but notice the villagers' reactions to them. People peered out from behind lace curtains, their faces pale and eyes filled with something that looked like fear. "Strange, isn't it?" Sarah whispered to Mark as they passed an elderly woman who quickly averted her gaze. "Maybe they're just not used to outsiders," Mark replied, though he seemed uneasy as well. They reached the village square, where a centuries-old oak tree stood proudly. Beneath its sprawling branches was a weathered stone bench. They sat down, enjoying the cool evening breeze. "I think we'll be happy here," Mark said, breaking the silence. "It's exactly what we needed." Sarah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the looks on the villagers' faces, wondering what could have caused such unease. A sudden chill ran down her spine and she shivered. "Cold?" Mark asked, concerned. "Just a little," Sarah lied. "Let's head back." As they walked back to their cottage, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the fading light. Once inside, they locked the doors and windows, more out of habit than necessity. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house as it settled. Mark was already asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard a faint whisper, like a breath against her ear. "Leave." Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the room, but it was empty, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight through the curtains. Convincing herself it was just her imagination, she closed her eyes again, trying to push away the lingering sense of unease. Unbeknownst to Sarah and Mark, their arrival in Hollow Glen had awakened something ancient and restless. The village, with its picturesque facade, was not the peaceful haven it appeared to be. And as they would soon discover, some places are better left undisturbed. The following morning, the sun rose bright and early, casting a golden hue over the village. Sarah awoke feeling more rested, the memory of the whisper fading into the recesses of her mind. She and Mark had breakfast together in the small, sunlit kitchen, discussing their plans for the day. "How about we go meet some of the locals today?" Mark suggested as he buttered his toast. "Maybe they can tell us more about the history of the village." "Sounds like a good idea," Sarah agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease from the previous night. It might help us feel more settled. They set out shortly after, their footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestone streets. The village was bathed in the warm glow of morning light, giving it a serene and inviting appearance. Yet, the sense of being watched persisted. Their first stop was the village's only general store, a small rustic building with a sign that read Hollow Glen Emporium. As they entered, a bell above the door jingled, announcing their arrival. The store was dimly lit, filled with an assortment of goods ranging from fresh produce to handmade crafts. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw them. "Good morning," Mark greeted cheerfully. "We're new in town and thought we'd introduce ourselves." The man's expression softened, though there was still a hint of wariness in his gaze. "Morning," he replied gruffly. "Name's Henry. What brings you to Hollow Glen?" "We were looking for a change of pace," Sarah explained. "The city life was getting too hectic, and we fell in love with the charm of this village." Henry nodded slowly. "It's a quiet place, all right. Folks around here keep to themselves mostly." "We noticed," Mark said, trying to keep the conversation light. "Is there anything we should know about the village? Any traditions or local legends?" Henry's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he answered. "Just respect the old places. Hollow Glen has a lot of history. Some of it best left alone." Before they could ask more, another customer entered the store, and Henry turned his attention away. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, feeling the weight of his words. As they continued their walk, they passed a group of children playing in the street. One of the children, a girl with long, dark hair, stopped and stared at them with wide, solemn eyes. "You're the new people," she said matter-of-factly. "Yes, we are," Sarah replied with a smile. "What's your name?" "Lizzie," the girl answered. "You should be careful. The spirits don't like newcomers." Mark chuckled nervously. "Spirits, huh? Are there ghosts in this village?" Lizzie nodded earnestly. "They live in the old houses in the woods. They don't like it when people come here." "Well, we'll be sure to be respectful," Sarah said, trying to keep her tone reassuring. The girl simply nodded and ran off to join her friends, leaving Sarah and Mark standing there, the eerie warning hanging in the air. Their next stop was the village inn, a charming ivy-covered building that looked like it had stood for centuries. Inside, they found a cozy, welcoming atmosphere, with a roaring fire in the hearth and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. The innkeeper, a plump woman with a warm smile, greeted them enthusiastically. "Welcome. You must be the new couple everyone's been talking about." "That's us," Mark confirmed. "I'm Mark, and this is my wife, Sarah. Pleasure to meet you both," the woman said. "I'm Edith. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Edith," Sarah said, feeling a bit more at ease. "Can you tell us more about the village? We're eager to learn all we can." Edith's smile faltered for a moment. Hollow Glen is a lovely place, but it has its quirks. We've had our share of stories over the years. Some say the spirits of those who lived here long ago still roam these streets. Like ghosts? Mark asked, trying to sound casual. Something like that, Edith replied. But don't you worry. Most of the time they're harmless. Just don't go poking around places you shouldn't. With each encounter, Sarah and Mark's excitement about their new home began to mix with a growing sense of unease. The villagers' cryptic warnings and the palpable tension hinted at something darker lurking beneath Hollow Glen's picturesque surface. As they made their way back to the cottage, the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, foreboding shadows. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their presence had disturbed something ancient and malevolent. Little did they know, their odd welcome was just the beginning of the horrors that awaited them in Hollow Glen. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Hollow Glen was enveloped in an eerie twilight. Sarah and Mark returned to their cottage, feeling a mixture of intrigue and apprehension. The villagers' warnings and strange behavior had cast a shadow over their excitement. They tried to brush it off as local superstition, but unease gnawed at them. That night, as they settled in, the cottage felt different. The warm, welcoming atmosphere of the morning had given way to a chilling stillness. They sat by the fireplace, sipping tea and trying to shake off the day's strange encounters. "Do you think there's any truth to what the villagers were saying?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Probably just old stories to keep outsiders away. You know how small towns can be." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't dismiss the feeling of being watched. As they prepared for bed, she made sure to lock all the doors and windows. The memory of the whisper from the previous night lingered in her mind. Later, as they lay in bed, the house creaked and groaned with the sounds of settling wood. Sarah tossed and turned, unable to find a comfortable position. Mark was already asleep, his breathing steady and calm. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it again, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "Leave." Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the whisper had vanished, leaving only the creaks of the old house. She told herself it was just her imagination, a lingering effect of the unsettling day. The following morning, Sarah woke early, determined to shake off her fears. She headed to the kitchen to make breakfast, but as she entered, she stopped short. The chairs around the table had been rearranged, forming a circle in the center of the room. "Mark, did you move the chairs last night?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" He looked at the chairs and frowned. "I didn't touch them." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She quickly moved the chairs back, trying to dismiss the strange occurrence as a simple misunderstanding. As the days passed, more unsettling incidents occurred. Objects moved on their own, shadows flickered across the walls, and doors that were securely shut were found open. Sarah began to feel as though the house itself was alive, watching and waiting. One afternoon, while Mark was at the village square running errands, Sarah decided to explore the cottage's attic. She climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The attic was dimly lit, filled with dusty old furniture and cobweb-covered trunks. As she sifted through the forgotten relics, she came across a small, ornate box. Curiosity piqued. She opened it and found an old diary, its leather cover worn and cracked. She flipped through the pages, filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in the cottage over a century ago. Sarah sat down and began to read. Margaret's entries detailed a life of joy and sorrow, but as she continued, the tone shifted. The later entry spoke of a plague that had swept through Hollow Glen, claiming the lives of many villagers. Margaret wrote of strange occurrences, of feeling watched, and of ghostly apparitions haunting her home. One entry caught Sarah's eye. June 13th, 1884. The spirits grow restless. They whisper in the night, their voices filled with anguish. They claim this house as their own, seeking to drive us away. We must find a way to appease them, or we will be doomed to share their fate. Sarah's heart raced as she read the final, hastily scrawled entry. July 7th, 1884. The ritual is our last hope. We must perform it at midnight under the full moon to break the curse. I pray it works, for if it does not, the spirits will reclaim what they believe is theirs. A sudden noise from downstairs startled Sarah, causing her to drop the diary. She hurried back down, finding Mark in the living room. "Sarah, something's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw a shadow. It wasn't mine. It moved on its own." Sarah showed him the diary, recounting Margaret's experiences. "We need to find out more about this ritual," she said urgently. "It's the only way to break the curse." Mark nodded, fear and determination mingling in his eyes. Together they realized that the strange occurrences were not mere coincidences. The spirits of Hollow Glen were indeed restless, and their new home was at the center of a century-old curse. As night fell once more, Sarah and Mark braced themselves for the unknown. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows more pronounced. The spirits were making their presence known, and the couple knew that their only hope lay in uncovering the secrets of the past before it was too late. Determined to uncover the secrets of Hollow Glen and the ritual mentioned in Margaret's diary, Sarah and Mark decided to visit the village historian. Mr. Whitaker, they had heard, was a wealth of knowledge on the village's past. The cottage they sought was at the far edge of the village, nestled under the shadow of the forest. They arrived at the historian's home, an old stone building covered in ivy. The wooden sign hanging above the door read, "Whitaker Archives." Sarah and Mark exchanged a look of apprehension before knocking. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with sharp blue eyes and a thick mane of white hair. "Mr. Whitaker?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The old man nodded. "That's me. What brings you here?" "We recently moved into the old cottage on Maple Street," Sarah began. "We've experienced some unusual occurrences and found a diary that mentions a curse and a ritual. We were hoping you could tell us more about it." Whitaker's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in. It's not often I get visitors curious about the darker side of Hollow Glen's history." They followed him into a cluttered study, filled with dusty books, yellowed maps, and old photographs. Whitaker motioned for them to sit at a large oak table in the center of the room. He took a seat opposite them, folding his hands on the table. "The village of Hollow Glen has a long and troubled history," Whitaker began. "The plague that struck in the late 1800s decimated the population. Many of the victims were buried in mass graves, their souls left to wander restlessly." Sarah shivered at the thought. "We read about the plague in Margaret's diary. She mentioned a ritual to break the curse. Do you know anything about it?" Whitaker nodded. "The ritual is an old one, passed down through generations. It was said to have been devised by the village's founder, Elias Holloway, to appease the spirits and prevent them from seeking vengeance. The ritual involves certain artifacts and must be performed precisely at midnight during a full moon." Mark leaned forward, his interest piqued. What kind of artifacts are we talking about? Personal items of the deceased, Whitaker explained. Things they held dear in life. The ritual requires gathering these items and performing a series of incantations to bind the spirits and lay them to rest. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, the gravity of the situation settling in. Do you have any idea where we might find these artifacts? Sarah asked. Whitaker rose from his chair and moved to a dusty bookshelf. He pulled out a large leather-bound book and opened it to a page filled with hand-drawn maps and notes. These maps detail the locations of the old homes and the burial sites. Some of the artifacts may still be in the possession of the villagers, passed down as heirlooms. Others might be buried with the dead. As they pored over the maps, a sense of urgency grew within them. The full moon was only a few days away, and they had little time to gather the necessary items and learn the ritual. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, Mark said, closing the book and standing up. We need to get started on this right away. Whitaker nodded solemnly. Be careful. The spirits are not to be trifled with. And remember, the ritual must be performed exactly as described, or it could make things worse. Sarah and Mark left the historian's house, their minds racing with the task ahead. They knew they had to find the artifacts and prepare for the ritual, or they risked being consumed by the vengeful spirits of Hollow Glen. As they walked back to their cottage, the shadows seemed to grow darker and the air colder. The spirits were watching, waiting. Sarah and Mark steeled themselves, knowing that the days ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they were determined to break the curse and reclaim their home from the restless dead. The days grew shorter as Sarah and Mark plunged into their research, driven by the urgency of the approaching full moon. The air in Hollow Glen seemed to thrum with a sinister energy, and the shadows lengthened with each passing hour. Armed with the knowledge from Mr. Whitaker and the maps detailing the locations of the old homes and burial sites, they began their quest to find the necessary artifacts. Their first stop was the abandoned chapel at the edge of the village, said to be the final resting place of many plague victims. The chapel stood in ruins, its once grand spire now a crumbling relic. Vines crept up the stone walls, and the wooden door hung ajar, creaking eerily in the wind. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere was heavy with an oppressive silence. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that filtered through the broken stained glass windows. They moved carefully through the debris, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Look over here, Mark called softly, pointing to a row of ancient wooden pews. This looks like a good place to start. Sarah joined him, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of the artifacts they sought. As she approached one of the pews, she noticed a small, tarnished locket lying on the floor. She picked it up, feeling a chill run through her as she opened it to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman. Could this be one of them? Sarah asked, showing the locket to Mark. Only one way to find out, Mark replied, carefully placing the locket in a small velvet pouch they had brought for collecting the artifacts. They continued their search, finding more items hidden among the rubble. A child's toy horse, a silver ring, and a worn leather journal. Each item seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy, as if the spirits of their owners were watching closely. As they left the chapel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. She glanced back several times, but the only movement was the swaying of the trees in the breeze. She took Mark's hand, drawing comfort from his presence. Their next destination was the village square, where they hoped to find more artifacts among the shops and homes that had stood for centuries. They visited the general store first, hoping to speak with Henry again. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and Henry looked up from the counter, his expression guarded. We found some items in the old chapel, Sarah began, showing him the locket. Do you recognize this? Henry's eyes widened and he nodded slowly. That belonged to Abigail, a young woman who died during the plague. She was betrothed to Elias Holloway, the village founder. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, realizing the significance of their find. Do you know where we might find any other personal items from that time? Mark asked. Henry hesitated, then sighed. There's an old chest in my attic. It's been in my family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather. I believe it contains some items from the plague victims. He led them upstairs to a dusty attic filled with old furniture and cobwebs. In the corner, an ornate chest sat covered in dust. Henry opened it, revealing an assortment of objects: a delicate handkerchief, a brass key, and an intricately carved wooden comb. These should help, Henry said, his voice tinged with sadness. I hope you can break the curse. With their collection of artifacts growing, Sarah and Mark felt a renewed sense of determination. They visited several other homes and spoke to the villagers, gathering more items and learning snippets of the village's dark history. Each artifact carried a piece of the past, and the weight of their task grew heavier. As the sun set on the eve of the full moon, they returned to their cottage, their velvet pouch now filled with the personal belongings of Hollow Glen's long-deceased residents. They spread the items out on the table, feeling the oppressive energy emanating from them. We have everything we need, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Now we just have to perform the ritual, Mark replied, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of hope and determination. They spent the rest of the evening studying Margaret's diary and Mr. Whitaker's notes, memorizing the incantations and the precise steps of the ritual. They knew there was no room for error. Any mistake could make the curse stronger or even irreversible. As midnight approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers of the spirits grew louder, echoing through the walls of the cottage. Sarah and Mark took a deep breath, steeling themselves for the task ahead. They gathered the artifacts and stepped out into the night, ready to face the restless dead and reclaim their home. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over Hollow Glen. The village seemed to hold its breath as Sarah and Mark made their way to the ancient oak tree in the village square, the site where the ritual would take place. They arranged the artifacts in a circle, their hands trembling as they prepared to confront the malevolent forces that haunted their new home. The night was silent, save for the whispers of the spirits. Sarah and Mark stood side by side, their voices joining in the incantation that would either break the curse or bind them forever to the fate of Hollow Glen. As the full moon's light bathed the village square in an otherworldly glow, Sarah and Mark stood at the ancient oak tree, their hearts pounding in unison. The air was thick with anticipation, and the artifacts lay in a circle around them, ready for the ritual. They began the incantations, their voices trembling but growing steadier with each word. The whispers of the spirits seemed to rise in response, swirling around them like a cold wind. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, flickering in and out of existence. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and an icy chill swept through the square. Mark's breath came out in visible puffs, and Sarah shivered despite her thick coat. As they continued the ritual, Mark's eyes began to glaze over, and his voice took on an eerie, hollow tone. "Mark, are you okay?" Sarah asked, her concern cutting through her concentration. He didn't respond. Instead, his body stiffened and his movements became jerky and unnatural. His eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now seemed distant and cold. A sinister smile crept across his face, sending a jolt of fear through Sarah. "Mark, snap out of it!" she shouted, grabbing his arm and shaking him. Mark turned to her, his expression a mask of malevolent delight. "He belongs to us now," he said, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. "No! Leave him alone!" The possessed Mark laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the square. "You cannot stop us. This place is ours. It always has been." Sarah's mind raced. She had to finish the ritual, but she couldn't do it alone. Desperation fueled her actions as she continued the incantations, her voice growing louder, more urgent. She hoped against hope that the ritual would be enough to drive the spirits away and free Mark. But Mark's body lunged at her, his hands reaching out with an unnatural strength. Sarah barely dodged, her heart pounding in her ears. She grabbed one of the artifacts, the locket, and held it up like a shield. "Stop this!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Release him!" The locket began to glow faintly, and for a moment Mark hesitated. The malevolent smile faltered, and his eyes flickered with a hint of recognition. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice his own for just a fleeting second. Encouraged, Sarah held the locket closer. "Mark, fight them! I know you're still in there!" Mark's body convulsed, and the malevolent presence seemed to retreat slightly. "Keep going," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "Finish the ritual." Sarah nodded, her resolve strengthening. She resumed the incantations, her voice unwavering despite the fear coursing through her. The air around her crackled with energy, and the whispers of the spirits grew louder, more frantic. The artifacts began to glow, their light merging into a bright circle around Sarah and Mark. The shadows writhed and screamed, and Mark's body shook violently as the spirits fought to maintain their hold on him. With a final, desperate push, Sarah shouted the last words of the ritual. The light from the artifacts blazed brighter than the moon, and a shockwave of energy erupted from the circle, sending the shadows fleeing into the night. Mark collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. Sarah rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. "Mark, please wake up," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her with a weary but genuine smile. "Sarah." She hugged him tightly, relief washing over her. "You're back. You're really back." Mark nodded weakly. "You did it. You saved me." As they sat together under the ancient oak tree, the full moon casting its light over them, the village seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The spirits had been driven back, at least for now. But Sarah and Mark knew that their fight was not yet over. The ritual had only been a temporary measure. To truly break the curse, they would need to uncover more about the village's dark history and find a permanent solution. But for tonight, they held each other close, grateful for the small victory they had won. As they made their way back to their cottage, the whispers had faded, and the oppressive energy had lifted slightly. Yet, the memory of Mark's possession lingered, a stark reminder of the dangers they still faced. They knew they had to be vigilant, for the spirits of Hollow Glen were far from defeated. The dawn brought a brief respite from the horrors of the previous night. Sarah and Mark slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of vengeful spirits and the malevolent force that had taken hold of Mark. As the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, Sarah woke with a start, the urgency of their situation weighing heavily on her mind. Mark stirred beside her, his face pale and drawn. "We need to find a permanent solution," he murmured, echoing her thoughts. Sarah nodded, determination replacing her fear. "We can't keep fighting them off night after night. We need to break the curse for good, They spent the morning gathering their thoughts and formulating a plan. The key to their success lay in Mr. Whitaker's vast knowledge and the detailed maps he had provided. They needed to delve deeper into the village's history and uncover the secrets that had been buried for centuries. Armed with Margaret's diary and the artifacts they had collected, they headed back to Whitaker's house. The old historian greeted them with a somber nod, his eyes reflecting the gravity of their situation. "We managed to perform the ritual," Sarah explained, "but it was only a temporary fix. We need to find a way to break the curse permanently." Whitaker led them into his cluttered study, where he pulled out a thick, leather-bound tome. "This book contains the history of Hollow Glen, written by Elias Holloway himself. It might hold the answers you seek." As they pored over the ancient text, they discovered a passage that spoke of a powerful talisman created by Holloway to protect the village from dark forces. According to the book, the talisman had been hidden away, its location known only to the Holloway family. "The talisman," Whitaker said, his voice low, "is the key to breaking the curse. If you can find it and use it in conjunction with the ritual, you might be able to banish the spirits for good." "But where do we start looking?" Mark asked, his brow furrowed in frustration. Whitaker pointed to a map of the village. "There is an old Holloway estate on the outskirts of the village. It's been abandoned for years, but it might hold clues to the talisman's location." Without wasting another moment, Sarah and Mark set out for the Holloway estate. The journey took them through dense woods, where the trees seemed to close in around them, and the shadows grew darker. The path was overgrown and difficult to navigate, but their determination fueled their progress. The estate was a grand, decaying mansion, its windows broken and its once beautiful facade now covered in ivy and moss. They approached cautiously, feeling the weight of centuries of history pressing down on them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. They moved carefully through the darkened halls, their footsteps echoing eerily. As they searched room after room, they found remnants of the Holloway family's life, faded photographs, crumbling furniture, and old, yellowed letters. In the mansion's library, they discovered a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Sarah's heart raced as she opened it, revealing a delicate silver amulet, the talisman they had been searching for. "This must be it," she whispered, holding the talisman up to the light. It seemed to pulse with a faint inner glow. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with hope. "We need to get this back to the village and prepare for the final ritual." As they made their way back to Hollow Glen, the sky began to darken with storm clouds, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The village was eerily quiet when they arrived, the oppressive energy even stronger than before. They went straight to Mr. Whitaker's house, where the historian was waiting for them. He helped them prepare for the ritual, ensuring they had everything they needed. The talisman was placed at the center of the circle of artifacts, its glow now brighter and more intense. As night fell, the full moon rose once more, casting an eerie light over the village square. Sarah and Mark stood by the ancient oak tree, their hands clasped tightly together. Mr. Whitaker joined them, his presence a comforting anchor in the sea of uncertainty. They began the incantations, their voices rising and falling in harmony. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows seemed to gather around them, drawn to the power of the talisman. The spirits' whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they sensed their impending defeat. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the talisman blazed with a blinding light. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms becoming more distinct and more terrifying. Sarah and Mark continued the ritual, their voices unwavering despite the chaos around them. The spirits lashed out, their fury palpable, but the talisman's light held them at bay. As the final words of the incantation echoed through the square, a wave of energy surged outward, pushing the shadows back. The spirits screamed in anguish, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The light from the talisman dimmed, and the air grew still. Sarah and Mark stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. Slowly, they realized that the oppressive energy had lifted, and the village seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "It's over," Sarah whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. Mark pulled her into a tight embrace. "We did it. We really did it." Mr. Whitaker approached, his eyes filled with awe and gratitude. "You freed the village from the curse. Hollow Glen can finally know peace." As they stood together under the ancient oak tree, the full moon casting its gentle light over them, Sarah and Mark knew that they had triumphed. The curse was broken, and the spirits of Hollow Glen had been laid to rest. But the memory of their ordeal would stay with them forever, a reminder of the darkness that had once haunted their home and the strength they had found in each other to overcome it. Despite their victory the night before, Sarah and Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. The spirits had been driven back, but the full moon's light revealed that their battle was not yet over. The oppressive energy seemed to have lessened, but the whispers and shadows still lurked at the edges of their consciousness. Determined to end the curse once and for all, Sarah and Mark, accompanied by Mr. Whitaker, prepared for what they hoped would be the final confrontation. They fortified themselves with the talisman and the artifacts, knowing they had to face the spirits head-on to truly break the curse. As midnight approached, the trio made their way to the village square once more. The ancient oak tree loomed over them, its gnarled branches twisting in the moonlight. The air was thick with anticipation, and the silence was almost deafening. "We need to be ready for anything," Whitaker warned, his voice steady despite the tension. "The spirits won't go quietly." They arranged the artifacts in a precise circle, placing the talisman in the center. Sarah and Mark stood on opposite sides, while Whitaker took his position near the ancient oak tree. They began the incantations, their voices blending in a powerful harmony that resonated through the square. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath them trembled. The shadows around the square seemed to coalesce, forming dark, indistinct shapes that writhed and twisted. The spirits' whispers grew louder, more urgent, as they closed in on the circle of artifacts. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the square, extinguishing the candles they had lit. The darkness deepened and the spirits surged forward, their forms becoming more defined and terrifying. Sarah and Mark continued their incantations, their voices rising above the cacophony of the spirits' wails. One of the spirits lunged at Mark, its spectral hand reaching out to grasp him. The talisman flared with a bright light, repelling the spirit and forcing it back. But more spirits followed, their anger and desperation driving them forward. "Keep going!" Whitaker shouted, his voice barely audible above the din. "Don't let them break the circle!" Sarah felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her arm, and she shuddered, fighting the urge to flee. She focused on the incantation, pouring all her strength into the words. The talisman glowed brighter, its light pushing back the darkness. Mark struggled to keep his footing as the spirits swarmed around him, their voices a discordant chorus of pain and rage. He could feel their icy grip on his soul, pulling him towards the darkness, but he refused to give in, drawing strength from Sarah's unwavering determination. With a final desperate push, they completed the incantation. The talisman's light blazed with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. The spirits shrieked in agony, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke that were carried away by the wind. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air as the curse was finally broken. The energy that had held the spirits captive for centuries was released, dissipating into the night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. As the light from the talisman faded, Sarah and Mark collapsed to the ground, exhausted but triumphant. Whitaker rushed to their side, his face etched with relief and gratitude. "It's over," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You've done it. The curse is broken." They sat together under the ancient oak tree, the full moon casting its gentle light over them. The village was silent, but it was a peaceful silence, free from the malevolent whispers and shadows that had haunted it for so long. Sarah looked at Mark, her eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. "We did it. We really did it." Mark nodded, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and elation. "I couldn't have done it without you." Whitaker placed a hand on their shoulders, his voice filled with pride. "You've saved Hollow Glen. The spirits can finally rest, and the village can begin to heal." As they made their way back to their cottage, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The village seemed to shimmer with a newfound vitality, as if it had been reborn. Sarah and Mark knew that their lives would never be the same, but they also knew that they had triumphed over a darkness that had haunted Hollow Glen for centuries. With the curse broken and the spirits laid to rest, they could finally look forward to a future filled with hope and peace. The village of Hollow Glen, once a place of fear and despair, was now a sanctuary where they could rebuild their lives and create new memories, free from the shadows of the past. The dawn that followed the final confrontation brought with it a sense of tranquility that Sarah and Mark had never experienced in Hollow Glen. The village, once shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere, now seemed to glow with newfound vitality. The shadows that had haunted them were gone, and for the first time since their arrival, they felt truly at peace. Despite their exhaustion, Sarah and Mark knew their work was not yet finished. They had broken the curse, but they needed to ensure that it would never return. With Mr. Whitaker's guidance, they set out to perform the final steps necessary to secure their victory. The trio gathered in the village square once more, this time in the early light of morning. The ancient oak tree, which had been a witness to so much suffering, now stood as a symbol of their triumph. The talisman, though its light had dimmed, still pulsed with a residual energy that would be crucial for the final ritual. "We need to bury the talisman and the artifacts in a place where they will remain undisturbed," Whitaker explained. "This will seal the spirits and prevent the curse from ever being revived." Sarah and Mark nodded, their resolve unshaken. They chose a spot beneath the ancient oak tree, its roots entwining with the earth like the guardians of a sacred grave. With careful hands, they dug a hole, deep enough to ensure that the talisman and artifacts would remain hidden for eternity. As they placed the items in the ground, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. These objects had once belonged to people who had lived and loved, their lives cut short by tragedy. She whispered a silent prayer, hoping that their spirits had finally found peace. Mark covered the hole, patting down the earth with a sense of finality. "It's done," he said, his voice steady. "The curse is broken." Whitaker nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "You've done more than break a curse. You've given this village a chance to heal, to move forward." As they stood together, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, bathing the village in a golden glow. The air was filled with the sounds of birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had once pervaded Hollow Glen. The villagers who had been cautiously watching from their homes began to emerge, drawn by the sense of change that had swept through their community. They approached Sarah, Mark, and Whitaker, their faces filled with gratitude and relief. "You've saved us," an elderly woman said, tears streaming down her face. "We can finally live without fear." A young man stepped forward, holding out a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given us hope." Sarah and Mark accepted the villagers' thanks with humility, knowing that their victory was a shared one. They had been guided by the knowledge of the past and supported by the strength of their love and determination. As the day wore on, the village came alive with celebration. The dark memories that had once haunted Hollow Glen were being replaced by laughter and joy. The spirits, now at peace, no longer lingered in the shadows, allowing the village to flourish once more. That evening, Sarah and Mark returned to their cottage, their hearts light with the knowledge that they had triumphed over the darkness. They stood in the garden hand in hand, watching as the sun set behind the trees, casting a warm, golden light over their home. "We did it," Sarah said softly, leaning her head on Mark's shoulder. "We broke the curse." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the same sense of accomplishment. "And we did it together." Their bond had been tested and strengthened by the trials they had faced. The horrors of the past would always be a part of their story, but they had emerged stronger and more united. As night fell, they lit a fire in the hearth and settled down together, the flickering flames casting a comforting glow over the room. The cottage, once filled with shadows and whispers, was now a sanctuary of warmth and love. Sarah picked up Margaret's diary, tracing her fingers over the worn leather cover. "I think we should keep this," she said, "as a reminder of what we've overcome." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And as a way to honor those who came before us. Their stories deserve to be remembered." With the diary safely tucked away, they turned their thoughts to the future. Hollow Glen was now a place of promise, where they could build a new life free from fear. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, and now they looked forward to the light. As they drifted off to sleep, the village of Hollow Glen lay quiet and peaceful, its shadows banished, its spirits at rest. The curse had been broken, and the village had been given a new lease on life. And for Sarah and Mark, their journey was just beginning, filled with hope, love, and the promise of a bright future.